When you're told you're too much, it starts to seep into the corners of your life like water into a dry wall, slow, unnoticed at first, until the plaster crumbles and the stain is impossible to hide. My name is Naomi Carter, and for years I lived in that subtle, corrosive damp. I thought love was a shelter, but mine became the weather that eroded me. I met Daniel on a Wednesday evening at a gallery opening. He had the easy laugh and an eye for light, which is how architects and designers fall for each other, I suppose. He spoke about lines and space and how a room can hold memories before people even step through the door. He listened when I spoke too, really listened, leaning forward in the sort of way that made me feel seen. It felt like a rare translation. He translated the quiet parts of me into language. We fell in love in that slow, windy way. Dinners that stretched into arguments about art, morning coffees that turned into weekend road trips, the soft ritual of two lives inching toward habit. He was proud of me in public introductions to friends, supportive comments at my small design showings. He said things like, "You make everything better," and for a while I believed him without reservation. The first whisper of change came as a compliment that was also a wedge. One evening he said, "You're beautiful when you're understated. Maybe try that more." It was small, tiny really, but it left a footprint. I noticed the way his eyes lingered longer when I wore simpler dresses. I noticed his quiet approval when I didn't voice my loud ideas at parties. I learned, without him saying it directly, that my brightness was an inconvenience to him. It escalated in ways I didn't name then. He would call me dramatic, in a tone that made me apologize for raising my voice. He would correct my speech, substitute my words for his smoother versions when we told friends the story of how we met. He would take credit for my suggestions in meetings, small things at first, a mood, lit detail here, a layout tweak there, and if I raised the point, he smiled the patient smile of someone explaining an obvious mistake. "You're too sensitive, Naomi," he'd say, as if sensitivity itself were a failing. I blame myself in the early days because that's what we're taught to do with love's fractures. We blame the version of self that shows up imperfectly. I edited myself, my wardrobe, my schedule, my laugh, until it fit better into the spaces where he was comfortable. If you'd asked me then if I was happy, I would have told you yes, or rather, what I wanted was to be yes. I wanted to be the woman who didn't cause trouble, who accommodated quietly and received kindness in return. The big turning point came suddenly, like thunder after a long hot day. We were in the middle of a project deadline. My firm had just taken on a community arts center, and I was the lead designer. It was the first time I had been trusted with something that mattered on such a scale. I was working late at the studio, sketching the daylight strategy for the main hall when my phone lit up with his name. "Dinner, we need to talk," he typed. I remember feeling a prickle of worry, the way tension settles under your skin. When I arrived home, he was waiting in the kitchen, the apartment smelling faintly of dinner and something else, perfume that was unfamiliar. He looked at me with eyes I once loved because they were confident and steady. Now they were calculating. "Naomi," he said, "I think we need to reconsider some things. I love you, but sometimes I think you're overwhelming. You have big ideas. You're intense." He spoke the words carefully, as if placing them on the countertop beside the salad. He wanted them to look harmless. He wanted me to take them and examine them, and inevitably to internalize whatever weight he'd placed upon them. "You're saying this now?" I asked, bewildered. "While I'm carrying our big project. Do you even see how hard I'm working?" He shrugged. I just think maybe, if you toned it down, people would respond better. You know how people are. They like simpler things. You should be simpler." The absurdity of that request still stings me. He wanted me to shrink in order to be loved. He wanted me to become less of myself so that his life could be easier. The choice was cruel in its novelty, not overt violence, but a persistent, corrosive erasure. The way a single word repeated daily can begin to change your reflection. For months I tried to be the softer version he desired. I removed color from my wardrobe. I changed the fonts in my presentations to something he recommended. I smiled more and gestured less. I learned to laugh on cue and to downplay my wins, and yet the more I edited, the smaller I felt. It was as though I had handed him a measurement chart and asked him to test how much of me could be removed before I disappeared. On the morning I realized the extent of the damage. It was raining in Paris outside the office windows where the not really huge firm I worked for rented space. I had flown for a small symposium to present a segment of our community project's concept. The room was full of faces that were both excited and bored. I kept my presentation crisp, my diagrams sleek, my voice steady. Afterwards, an older architect, a woman who had built more public spaces than I had been alive, came up to me, eyes warm, and said in a whisper, "You have a voice. Don't let it be softened." The phrase struck me with a shock of shame and grief. I walked back to my hotel room that night and sat on the bed with my suitcase open. I looked at the clothes I had strategically chosen to be easier, and I felt a deep, tired anger for what I had allowed. The next morning, I canceled the rest of my meetings. I called in sick. I didn't tell Daniel. I wish I could say my awakening was a single cinematic moment where light broke through dark clouds, and every choice after was obvious. It wasn't. It was a slow, stubborn unthreading. I began keeping a notebook where I wrote down every time I felt minimized, every too much, every sensitive, every small correction. Writing it out turned the fog into lines on a page. I could see the pattern. Seeing the pattern altered the shape of my fear. When I finally told Daniel I needed space, more time at the studio, more time alone to think, he laughed in that way of someone who has underestimated you for too long. "Space," he repeated. "You're being dramatic." The old reflex came up in me, to soften, to explain, to earn back favor like a child trying to be allowed into a club. But this time, the voice that answered was not his. It was mine, a low, unfamiliar firmness. "I need to find the version of myself that isn't defined by whether you approve of my edges," I said. We argued, of course. He accused me of being self-centered, hard to live with, of bringing intensity where it was not needed. I accused him of being petty, of patronizing, of using my vulnerability like a measuring stick to prove his preference. Our fights became mirrors, both of us reflecting what the other feared in ourselves. When we separated amicably on the surface, jagged underneath, I felt like a house cleared of old furniture, echoes where warmth should have been, but also somewhere in the dust a space to rebuild. For a while I allowed the grief to do its work. I let myself weep in safe places, in front of friends who held me without judgment, in the quiet hours of nights when the city hummed, and I felt like a small dot on a large, indifferent map. I stopped apologizing for my plans and my feelings. I learned to say no without explaining the paragraph that used to follow, no longer a prologue to a plea. Gradually, the world returned to its color. Then I started to rise, not in the dramatic, sudden way movies make you expect, but in small, decisive acts. I refused projects that required me to tone down the voice of the building. I took on more ambitious work. I painted with the colors I loved again. I let sunlight fall where it pleased and invited clients who valued risk. The day I realized I had become dangerous to the version of Daniel who needed me small was not theatrical. He sent a note, a short email asking to have coffee and apologize. He wanted to know what had changed. I read the message slowly, fingers numb. When I met him at the cafe 3 days later, he looked smaller than the man I'd loved. Maybe humiliation had done to him what belittling had done to me. It had shrunk him. He started speaking, stumbling through words that were meant to explain but sounded like defenses. He asked how I had found the courage to leave. I told him about the notebook, about the architect in Paris, about the little rituals I had created. Morning runs, late night sketches, a book club that taught me other people's stories. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. We spoke honestly, And when he asked if I regretted anything, I said only that it took me so long to stop apologizing for being whole. As I walked home after that coffee, the rain had stopped and the pavement caught stray light like a confetti of tiny mirrors. I lifted my face to the sky and let the city move around me. I felt, for the first time in years, like an intact thing. Building a new life isn't about what you tear down, it's about what you raise in its place. After the separation, I poured myself into the work that had once been merely a vocation and turned it into a mission. I left the old firm and started bringing together a small circle of collaborators. A structural engineer who loved bridges, a landscape designer who insisted gardens should feed both body and soul, and a project manager who could turn a dream into a timetable without making it soulless. We called ourselves Studio Lumen because light is what we meant to do and make. Our first commission was a modest community center on the edge of the city, a place for workshops and for people who needed a place to gather. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. I wanted the space to be a refuge, the kind of place where you could breathe and believe that it was okay to be noisy and messy and human. Everything I'd been told I shouldn't be. The clients were women mostly, and the way they talked about using the space made me prioritize warmth over austerity, intimacy over flash. We designed a central hall that opened to a garden, glass walls that could roll away and flood the interior with morning light. We installed smaller alcoves for conversation and big communal tables for skill, sharing. Every material choice had intention: wood that smelled like summer, tiles that could be rearranged for workshops. We wanted architecture that listened. During the construction days, I learned to love mornings again. I'd stand with our foreman watching a wall rise, and the satisfaction of seeing an idea become mortar, solid, sensible, resistant, was a balm to the ache of my history. Here, nothing could belittle me. This was proof I could make something endure. Work gave me steady deliverance, but change also happened in the mechanics of my friendships. People I had known superficially, former clients, colleagues who admired my early work became anchors. A woman named Priya, who ran a nonprofit, became a friend I could tell the truth to without punctuation. She taught me how to hold a plan and sharpen it, and in turn, I taught her how to consider light in a way that elevated her workshops. One day, months into the center's opening, there was an event, a panel for young women about careers in design. A handful of students showed up, eyes wide with the kind of hunger I remembered. I sat on the stage, and when someone asked me about confidence, I told the truth. Confidence, I said, is not the absence of fear. It's the daily decision to work in spite of it. Afterwards, a young woman came up and pressed my hand. Her voice trembled. "He says I'm too loud," she whispered. "I don't know what to do." I looked at her and saw myself, bright, nervous, sometimes ready to fade to avoid a scuffle. I told her about making lists of what mattered and about small rebellions, wearing the bold dress, sending in the pitch that scares you, starting the sentence you fear. She left with eyes like flint. That night I slept for the first time in a long while without the taste of lead in my mouth. Despite the healing, the past sometimes crawled back. Daniel's name would appear in an email, a press feature attributed to him, an industry event where his firm was mentioned. Once at a conference, I heard his voice introduce a panel. The words felt passable. I was not jealous of his success. I felt only a settled neutrality. He had chosen the shape he wanted. I had chosen mine. Everyone asked, friends and clients alike, how I had turned my anger into momentum. I would tell them the same story. Anger is useful if you feed it into the engine of action. It can be a kind of fuel, but it doesn't have to be the destination. The real victory is when the things you build outlast the bitterness that started them. 2 years after Studio Lumen had opened, we were shortlisted for an Urban Renewal Award. Our entry was about transforming derelict courtyards into shared kitchens and co-working gardens. We presented on a stage full of judges with faces that first looked skeptical, then curious. When they called our name as the winner, the applause felt less like applause for me than for the idea that people could shape cities with care. I cried quietly behind my palms. On the return train, I sat with the award on my lap and thought of the old life. I remembered small humiliations, the way Daniel mocked the projects I loved, the way he would mimic my laughter when trying to make a joke at my expense, and I felt no desire to sabotage him. The last thing I wanted was for my story to be beholden to revenge as an act of cruelty. I wanted redemption, for myself, for my work, and for the people who walked into our spaces and felt seen. Then, something unexpected happened. An editor who had been following Studio Lumen's work asked if I would write an essay on design and dignity for a national magazine. I said yes. I wrote about the relationship between space and voice, about how the rooms we create inform who we become. In a passage, I wrote something that surprised even me. When someone tells you to be smaller, they are not protecting you, they are protecting their weakness. The essay struck a chord, and emails poured in from women and men who had felt the same smallness. They told stories of partners and bosses and relatives who had tried to edit them. They thanked me for language that made them say, "Ah, so it's not just me." Power, I learned, was quieter than I had imagined. It wore no armor. It was a steady work of alignment, making sure what I built outside matched what I knew inside. It was showing up to meetings, to panels, to late night site inspections. It was calling my mother on Sundays. It was forgiving myself when I slept through an alarm. It was everything small braided into the large, and so life continued. Work, late dinners with friends, trips to exhibitions that fed me. I dated briefly and clumsily, learning that presence was the quality I valued most. I turned down those who tried to flatter me into compromise. When a man came into my life who reminded me of Daniel's initial charm, but not his pattern, I refused to be swayed. The difference between then and now was simple. I recognized the requests to shrink before I accepted them. One evening, a call came through from someone at Daniel's new firm. They'd like to collaborate. The voice said oddly formal. He explained they were bidding on a joint cultural redevelopment project and thought we might partner on it. I felt the tug I always felt at the intersection of challenge and memory. Part of me wanted to say no. I refused to ever meet him in a professional context. Another part of me saw an opportunity. Every project is an opportunity to set the record straight about what matters. We met. He had a tan, an easy grin, and a manner that had been polished in the years since we parted. We sat across from each other in a neutral office. He began with an apology, awkward, soft, like a bird learning to speak. "Naomi," he said, "I've been thinking about how I treated you. I was a coward and I'm sorry. Apologies are curious things. They can be swallowed whole as balm or they can be examined as evidence." I listened politely and then asked a question that mattered more than his contrition. "What will you do differently on this project?" It was a practical question. "I will share credit. I will be transparent. I will listen." He said it and watched my face for signs of belief. I told him I believed in accountability more than in speeches. If he wanted to partner, he would have to be willing to answer to the design team, to the community, to the outcomes, not just to charm a room. We collaborated in a manner that surprised both of us. He took responsibility where it was due. He called out small injustices in meetings instead of contributing to them. It was not redemption so much as an evolution. Two professionals working toward a shared good. There were moments when the old sting flared, but it was not enough to derail the work. The project became a success, not because of the spectacle of our reconciliation, but because we both dedicated ourselves to a result larger than our personal histories. Years fold over themselves like pages. In the time since I left, I have built a life that looks nothing like the one I thought I would need to be part of him. Studio Lumen became a small network. We mentored young designers, especially women who had been told too often to tone it down. We made spaces that welcomed noise, that honored complicated schedules, that had rooms where children could paint and elders could share stories. We worked in neighborhoods that had been written off and turned them into hubs of learning and laughter. One Sunday afternoon, I was walking through one of the community courtyards we'd renovated when I saw a girl of about 12 sitting on the steps with a sketch pad. I sat beside her. She showed me drawings of buildings that curved like waves. Her pencils were blunt from use, she said without prompting. My teacher said I draw too bright. The sentence sank into me like a stone. What do you like about your drawings? I asked. Her eyes lit up. The colors, she said. They make people feel something. I told her to keep that color and to never apologize for it. Later that week, I received an email from her mother thanking me for the space and for saying those words. The smallness I was told to be had become a lesson I refused to teach the next generation. Recognition came in different forms. Awards, yes, but also letters from those who had attended workshops and then gone on to start cooperatives and studios of their own. One woman, who had been quiet and reserved at our earliest sessions, later sent a photograph of a bustling communal kitchen she started. "You taught me that my voice has scale," she wrote. "Now we cook together and we vote together." Those notes arrived like parcels of proof. Structure makes possible new lives. And then there was the night that felt like an epilogue to a book I no longer needed to reread. Studio Lumen had organized a city-wide festival celebrating women in design. I was on a panel about mentorship and legacy. In the front row, entered quietly and sat an older man who looked vaguely familiar. Daniel. He had aged into a gentleness I had not seen before. At intermission, he approached me. "Naomi," he said simply, "you're doing good work." The words were sparse, but the face that held them had an honesty that used not to be his default. He told me his firm had changed. He had been forced to confront patterns, of taking credit, of smoothing over what made others uncomfortable. There was a weary humility in his voice. He asked without theatricality if we might find a way to support a scholarship for young women to attend our workshops together. I thought of the younger me stiff with compromise, hungry for approval. I thought too of the quiet folding work that had led us here, the designs, the gardens, the rooms where women learned to speak. I listened to the words he offered and weighed them by their actions. He had done the work. He was asking to contribute to the future. I accepted, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I wanted to construct a better present. When the festival ended, I walked home slowly beneath the hush of a city that had been softened by autumn rain. I thought about what people mean when they say someone is unbreakable. To me, unbreakable is not a refusal to feel. It is a capacity to bear and to transform. It is the daily decision to keep creating even when the world tells you to silence yourself. Some nights, when the quiet arrives and I am alone in my apartment, I pull out the notebook I kept in the beginning. The pages are a patchwork now. Some entries sharp with grief, others jubilant with design breakthroughs, a few dotted with plans and lists. The handwriting changes over time. The girl who started those notes is still there in the corners, but she's not the only voice. She has company, mentors, students, collaborators, friends who call out my name when I forget to celebrate. I look at the ink and trace the line from who I was to who I have become. Resilient but not immaculate, proud but not untouched. When friends ask me what the last laugh felt like, I tell them it wasn't a laugh at all. It was a quiet seat at a table I'd built with my own hands. It was being asked to speak at a conference and doing so without trembling. It was seeing a young woman in the courtyard who kept her colors. It was opening the front page of the paper and seeing a photograph of a building I'd designed with the caption, "A space that remembered the people who would live inside it." That caption felt like justice for the people whose voices built it. If anyone wonders whether revenge is worth it, whether the effort to rise is selfish, my answer is that rising is a kindness. It is a kindness to yourself and to the people who follow, because when you occupy space fully, you make it safe for others to do the same. I used to believe that the world would be kinder if I made myself smaller. The opposite was true. The world widened when I claimed my right to be large and tender at once. The man who tried to shrink me, he exists in the margins of my story now, like an old photograph tucked in a drawer. I do not wish him ill. I wish that he, too, learned that to be small is not a virtue. But mostly, I am satisfied watching the life I love expand, seeing rooms we made full of laughter, workshops full of voices, gardens full of strange and daring flowers. To the girl who is listening now, who has folded herself down to hold another's comfort, you are allowed to be loud. You are allowed to be bright. Carry your colors like a banner. If someone asks you to tone down your light, step away and build a place that honors it instead. You will be surprised at how many people will want to come inside. He tried to break me. He used his words like chisels, hoping to shape me small. But chisels are blunt tools against someone who decides not to be hollowed. I learned how to gather mortar and stone. I learned how to let sunlight in. I learned how to build. And when the world finally needed a room for those who are brave enough to speak, we opened the doors wide and welcomed them in.